I'm not going to be talking about Islamic theories of matter. I'm going to talk about, as if they're coming from the Quran, I'm going to be talking about a historical moment and views of matter, and particularly views of matter and body. It's going to in many ways complement Tanya's earlier talk where she talked about matter and some of the negative as privation. I'm going to be talking about matter as it's associated primarily with body, so another philosophical issue there. So like our contemporary notion of mass, matter among ancient and medieval philosophers was essentially linked with body, and yet was understood differently within competing paradigms. And I have to make sure I can get this thing to work. Oops, now I've got to go back. Okay. In the medieval Islamic world, the prevailing paradigms were Kalām and falsafa. Falsafa, as its name suggests, was a continuation of the Greek scientific tradition as represented most notably in Neoplatonized Aristotelianism. Kalām, in contrast, was in many ways a response to falsafa, which drew upon indigenous Islamic and Arabic sources, whether the Quran and Hadith, Islamic legal theory, or Arabic grammar. Now, despite their differences, both intellectual traditions agreed that body, the Arabic jism or germ, is a three-dimensional object. In contrast, there was no shared term for an understanding of matter, at least not in any technical sense. In a non-technical sense, however, both parties, with some exceptions, recognize something underlying and constitutive of bodies, and so something that is even more basic than body. At least as a starting point for this study, we can identify this more basic underlying constituent with matter broadly construed. Taken in this broad sense, proponents of Kalām, Islamic speculative theology, if you will, maintain that the most basic underlying constituents of body are atomic or discrete. And so loosely, what makes up bodies cannot be divisible infinitely. Division always terminates at some indivisible part. In contrast, proponents of falsafa, the Greek loanword for philosophy, argued that matter, as one of two basic underlying constituents of body, the other is form, is continuous. And so loosely, what makes up body must be divisible infinitely, at least conceptually. So here's towards explaining these basic Islamic conceptions of matter and body. I'm going to begin with Kalām atomism, and then I'm going to consider one of the towering figures of medieval Islamic philosophy, Ibn Sīnā, and his arguments against atomism and his own conception of matter. I focus on Ibn Sīnā, or Avicenna, if you will, view of matter, since virtually all of those in the post-Avicennan Islamic world either attack, adapt, or adopt his views. Appreciating Ibn Sīnā's novel account of matter, however, will involve a digression into earlier Greek philosophers, most notably Proclus and John Philoponus, and their views of matter. I will then conclude by looking at responses to Ibn Sīnā's account of matter, both in the Kalām and falsafa tradition after him. So, the most important basic motivating principle of Kalām atomism is the intuition that the realization of infinities is impossible. As impossible, or at least purportedly impossible, as impossible, infinities are not even the sort of thing that an omnipotent God could create, for omnipotence applies to all things possible. Now, given the purported impossibility of infinities, these thinkers maintain that one's analysis of body must terminate at some indivisible finite part. In Arabic, al-juz alladhi la yatajaz'u, or the singular substance, al-jahor or fard, both of which are identified with an atom. Now, one might grant that actual infinities are impossible, but also maintain a distinction between an actual infinity and a potential infinity. For certainly, one might object, potential infinities are possible, Obviously, the intuition goes, one could potentially divide a body, for example, into 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, and so on indefinitely. And even if the actual division is never carried out, such a division seems possible in potentiality. Kalām thinkers were not impressed with this move. They countered that if something were truly potential, then it must fall within the scope of an omnipotent agent's power to actualize that potential. Thus, let God actualize the potentially infinite latent divisions in a continuous body. In that case, there would be an actual infinity. But actual infinities, again, are supposedly impossible for an omnipotent agent to create. Thus, the analysis of body must terminate at some actually smallest part, which is itself indivisible. Moreover, these Kalām thinkers continued, this indivisible part is not only such that it cannot be physically divided any further, but also such that it cannot be conceptually divided any further. For conceptual divisions would correspond to potential divisions, which for the reasons seen must be finite in number, or so argued the Kalām thinkers. Now, because Kalām atoms were not even supposed to be conceptually divisible, they were consequently not considered bodies, properly speaking. That is because the general notion of a body is, again, that body is three-dimensional object. Thus, if an atom were a body, it would have three distinct dimensions, which would be tantamount to having three conceptual parts. Despite not being a body, Kalām atoms were viewed as essentially occupying a certain space. They were ḥadds. This space, which in effect is identical with or constitutes the atom, is the smallest possible positive extension without having zero magnitude. While not exactly points, Kalām atoms are thus point-like. Okay, so much for atomism. The most thorough criticism of atomism, as well as analysis of matter and body in the medieval Islamic world, is found in Ibn Sīnā, the Avicenna of Latin fame. He begins his discussion of body by sketching the sort of logical space for any theory of body. Body either has, and I can see you probably can't see it there, so I'm going to read them out loud. That'll help you see what's up there. One, either bodies have parts, or two, bodies do not have parts. This last one, that they don't have parts, is going to be Ibn Sīnā's preferred position. If one, a body has parts, then either those parts have to be infinite in number or finite in number. Those are your options. A part here refers to some discrete magnitude of some determinate extension, where an aggregation, ta'lif, of such parts forms a body. Now, the possibilities 1, A and B, and 2 divide the possibilities into contradictory opposites that purportedly exhaust all the ways that a body might exist in the world. So given this logical space, Ibn Sīnā argues that both 1A and 1B lead to absurdities, or at least are empirically falsified, and thus by reductio ad absurdum, a body must have no parts. Option 2. All right, so option 1 argues, as Ibn Sīnā, just as a non-starter. It's clearly false, although there were people at the time who held it. It again is that body is an aggregation of an infinity of parts, each of which has some positive determinate magnitude. Such a thesis, Ibn Sīnā notes, absurdly entails that all bodies would be infinite in size, for an infinite number of finite magnitudes, no matter how small, provided they have some positive extension, would make all bodies infinitely large, which is clearly false. Option 1B, that body is an aggregate of a finite number of parts, is Kalām atomism. Ibn Sīnā offers numerous arguments against the atomism of his time, ranging from the intuitively obvious to technical mathematical arguments. Now, as a note, Ibn Sīnā accepts that bodies have natural minimums, a point I will return to later, which are not further divisible by any physical means. Thus, his critique of Kalām atomism focuses on the idea that bodies are composed of conceptually indivisible parts. Now, Ibn Sina's mathematical arguments would prove the most challenging for subsequent defenders of atomism. While space precludes going into detail, Ibn Sina's general strategy is to press difficulties that a discrete analysis of body and space has in accommodating irrationals like pi and the square root of 2, which our best mathematics seems to require. There simply is no smallest common measure, i.e. an atomic unit, by which, for instance, both the legs and hypotenuse of a right triangle can be measured so as to even approximate the Pythagorean theorem, observes Ibn Sina. Thus, one must either give up the best proven theorem in the history of mathematics or give up conceptually indivisible parts. For Ibn Sina, the choice is obvious. Thus, concludes Ibn Sina, bodies in their ultimate analysis must lack parts. Now, to lack parts, he explains, and I'm quoting, means that the body presently has no part that one can posit as distinct, but rather the body is one by way of continuity, ittisal, which does not mean that it's not such as to be divided, end quote. Ibn Sina's account of continuity and the associated account of the form of corporeality are complex. I shall need to delve into some of those complexities, but for now let me make a somewhat simplistic first go at his definition, his essential definition, ḥadd, of continuity and the continuous. Following Aristotle in the categories, Ibn Sina takes the genus of the continuous to be either quantity, kam or kamia, or sometimes magnitude, miqdar. Now it's important to note that Ibn Sina explicitly distinguishes between substantial and accidental quantity. On the one hand, substantial quantity, which I discuss more fully when considering Ibn Sina's theory of the form of corporeality, is just indeterminate extension. That is, it's the potentiality to be a specific kind of body having definite dimensions. Accidental quantity, on the other hand, involves determinate or definite dimensions, like having the measurement of 1 meter and having a determinate shape, like being cuboidal or spherical. While the two notions were frequently conflated in the earlier Greek tradition, Ibn Sina clearly distinguishes between them. So when Ibn Sina defines continuity in the continuous, he intends as the genus of this definition accidental quantity, i.e. the quantity predicated of specific and determinate kinds of bodies. He's going to give a definition in terms of a genus and a difference. The genus is accidental, that is to say determinate body. Identifying the difference or differentia of continuity and the continuous is where the complexities come in. But again, as a first pass, what differentiates discrete quantities from continuous ones for Ibn Sina is that the continuous magnitude is a single unity in itself. I quote, so thus in his own categories, Ibn Sina writes, and I'm quoting, the difference of the continuous belongs, or the differentia belongs to its special property of being said of the magnitude that is one in itself, and whose measurement does not need some magnitude other than it, end quote. So for example, the standard meter rod in Paris simply is 1 meter. That's it. While one can certainly imagine it divided into and so measured by centimeters, millimeters, and the like, the rod in itself just is 1 meter, essentially lacking any further divisions. In general, then, Ibn Sina's account of the continuous is just what one sees in the physics, where he describes the continuous in negative terms, namely lacking parts. Now, however, he describes the differentia in positive terms, namely being a single unity in itself. Oops. Given this essential definition of continuity, Ibn Sīnā rejects defining the continuous in terms of infinite divisibility. Infinite divisibility, rather, is a proper description, a rasm, of the continuous. It is not a definition for Ibn Sīnā because infinite divisibility does not designate what is essential, or dhatia, to a continuous magnitude, but only a necessary accident, a lawahik or lawazim. That's because the continuous, again, is essentially one and a unity. And so any divisions in it must be brought about by an external agent, either severing the continuity of the continuous by physically dividing it and separating it, or by positing divisions in it, like imagining 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, and so on indefinitely. In the latter case, where the divisions are by mere positing, fard, the divisions do not correspond to real or positive features within the continuous magnitude itself, but divisions in one's estimative faculty, wahm, sort of think of your imagination on steroids. To the extent that such divisions are thought to be potentially within the magnitude, the potentiality, in Arabic the quwa, is merely a relative privation within a substance. Namely, nothing prevents an agent from at least positing divisions in it. There's nothing in it, just nothing prevents one from positing things about it. What potential divisions are not is some positive, latent, partially actualized feature of a continuous body awaiting to be fully actualized. Now, this last point provides the Ibn Sīnā with a principled response to the Kalām objection concerning potential infinite divisibility. Ibn Sīnā simply denies that an infinity of potential divisions latently exist within the continuous, awaiting to be fully actualized even by an omnipotent agent. Thus, a key premise in the Kalām argument by Ibn Sīnā's lights is just simply false. So, with an understanding of Ibn Sīnā's conception of the continuous, we can now turn to his theory of the form of corporeality. But before that, we must take a brief detour into late antique theories of matter and body. The Greek philosophical history surrounding potentiality, matter, and body is long and deep, but comes to a head in a dispute between Proclus, so 412 to 485, and John Philoponus, 419 to roughly 570, concerning the age of the world. At issue is what I shall call the regress argument, which can be traced back to Aristotle. Now, throughout his philosophy, Aristotle and the tradition following him characterized matter, and particularly first matter or prime matter, proto-hule, as essentially potentiality, the Greek dunamis or the Arabic quwa, that has whatever actuality it has only in virtue of some distinct form investing it with that actuality. As potentiality, however, matter was seen as necessary if there is to be any change whatsoever, for the potentiality is precisely what is actualized whenever there is a change from one currently actual state to some new state. In fact, Aristotle used matter's essential relation to potentiality to argue for the eternal pre-existence of both matter and form in order to explain any kind of generation or change. His argument is straightforward. Whatever comes to be at some point in time must have been potential prior to that time. Hence, if matter were to come to be at some time, there must have been the prior potential for that matter. But that prior potential would itself be essentially tied with a prior matter. Matter is essentially potentiality. And once you have that, off you are on an infinite regress. Thus, matter must pre-exist, argues Aristotle any coming to be. This just is the regress argument. Now, a version of the regress argument appears in Proclus' 18 Arguments for the Eternity of the World in his De Aeternitate Mundi. Of particular interest is argument 11, in which Proclus frames the regress argument in terms of what is for the sake of, ta heneca tu, and that for which it is for the sake of, ta hu heneca, rather than in terms of potentiality. Still, the general argumentative strategy of the two regresses is the same. If the world were not eternal, and so were not uncreated, and so uncreated, there would be an infinite regress of material causes. The Christian philosopher John Philoponus responded in his Contra Proclum. There, Philoponus offers a new theory of matter. Now, this new theory comes precisely in addressing the regress argument. So, setting aside the details, and there's a lot of details, Philoponus' general suggestion is this: matter should simply be identified with an indeterminate three-dimensional body. Thus, prime matter is not a potential body which only becomes an actual body when invested with a form. Rather, matter is nothing but a body of indeterminate dimensions. It is the indeterminate body, claims Philoponus, that is the receptacle of the forms that subsequently generate determinate bodies. So understood, nothing demands that the creation of an indeterminate body requires some prior or indeterminate body. The regress is blocked. The implication is that matter can have a beginning to its generation, namely when God creates this three-dimensionally indeterminate body, along with the accompanying forms that specify the various determinate bodies that make up our cosmos. Philoponus' new theory of matter effectively eliminates Aristotelian matter as a theoretical underlying constituent of body, for it makes indeterminate body ultimate and not further analyzable. Ibn Sīnā was heir to this Greek tradition, Aristotelian and anti-Aristotelian alike. His adaptation and reworking of this tradition are indeed remarkable in many ways. For instance, Ibn Sīnā seems to be the first to offer a non-inductive or non-analogical proof for the existence of matter. Moreover, while the notion of a form of corporeality, the Greek somatikon eidos or the Arabic sura jismiyya, can be traced back to the late Neoplatonic commentator Simplicius, Ibn Sīnā ties it in novel ways to his own unique views about continuity, potentiality, and prime matter, and even to a certain extent creation ex nihilo. So let us begin with his proof for the existence of prime matter. A simple version of the proof is found in his Pointers and Reminders. The proof there immediately follows upon Ibn Sīnā's critique of atomism, and so takes as proven that body is continuous. He now notes that while body is continuous, it's also accidentally discontinuous. The discontinuity of body involves its being either physically divided into distinct new bodies, or at least conceptually divided into measurable parts. As such, a continuous body has some feature that is receptive, the Greek dektikon or Arabic kabul, to discontinuity. Ibn Sīnā then continues, what is receptive, kabul, to something is other than what is received, Arabic makbul. Here, what is received is either the essential continuity by which a body is the body that it is, or what is received is the discontinuity by which the body ceases to be that body, in which case other bodies come to be, namely either two separated bodies or two conceptually distinct parts. Matter, in contrast of what is received, is what is receptive. Now, implicit in the Pointer's argument, but made explicit in the same version of it from the healing, is that what is receptive stands to what is received as potentiality stands to actuality. Thus, there is a potentiality that underlies a body's actual continuity and explains its potential discontinuity. Ibn Sina subsequently identifies this potentiality with prime matter, hyula, which is a Greek loanword hule. Thus, his argument for prime matter reintroduces potentiality. I find where I am. Okay, sorry. Matter into the analysis of body, and in doing so, his view is in keeping with Aristotelian metaphysics against the apparent attempt of Philoponus to replace Aristotelian prime matter with indeterminate body, which Philoponus did in order to avoid the regress argument. The regress argument again attempted to show that prime matter is an uncreated, pre-existent principle that stands alongside of God. Such a conclusion is simply unacceptable to Ibn Sina, who is adamant that everything but God is created, even if created eternally. To block the unwanted conclusion of the regress argument, Ibn Sina introduces the form of corporeality. The general idea, even if Ibn Sina is reticent to state it so bluntly, but it's what he's committed to, is that the form of corporeality invests non-being, lisa from the Arabic la and ice, la the absolute negation and ice being, with the very potentiality. So the form of corporeality invests non-being with the very potentiality needed for specific determinate bodies. The regress is blocked because below this potentiality there is only non-being, not some further potentiality tied to some more basic matter. Moreover, since for Ibn Sina all forms, including the form of corporeality, are created, Ibn Sina's theory of the form of corporeality involves a genuine case of creation ex nihilo, in Arabic ibda', even if for Ibn Sina it's going to be an eternal creation ex nihilo. Now, a word about the potentiality that the form of corporeality creates is warranted. In the healing, Ibn Sina identifies the potentiality with absolute body, jism mutlaq. Avicennan absolute body is nothing more than indeterminate three-dimensionality. As indeterminate body, Ibn Sina tells us, it simply has no line nor surface in it by which it would have some finite measured quantity or definite shape. Thus, absolute body for Ibn Sina appears to be infinitely extended continuous quantity, kamia, or unmeasured magnitude, miqdar, wholly one, and so neither actually differentiated nor physically separated into discrete entities. It is the substantial quantity that is distinct from the accidental quantities of the categories mentioned earlier. Now, although Ibn Sina does not explicitly say that absolute body is infinite empty space, and remember, even empty infinite space has got three dimensions, it's body in some respect. His description of this absolute body exactly matches his description of infinite void space from his physics, which he extensively argues can never exist just as infinite void space. Thus, immediately after arguing that prime matter is a potentiality identified with indeterminate dimensionality, i.e., infinite continuous void space, he hastens to add that prime matter can never be devoid of some species, form, or other that invests it with proper dimensions, shapes, and additional features like qualities that correspond with the various species of bodies, such as the sphere of the planets or the terrestrial elements, and the more complex bodies formed from the elements. Thus, for Ibn Sina, prime matter invested solely with the form of corporeality remains only at the conceptual level. In his various philosophical summae, Ibn Sina only ever implicitly relates the form of corporeality to his theory of creation ex nihilo in the way that I have. However, he explicitly relates them in his short treatise on heavenly bodies, Fil Ajram al-Ulwiya. Now, what is most remarkable and, I dare say, audacious about this little short treatise is that Ibn Sina ascribes his own theory of eternal creation ex nihilo to Aristotle. And so I quote, the teaching of the philosopher, El-Hakam, and he means Aristotle here, that the heavens are not generated from something, nor corrupted into something because they have no contrary, refers to this, namely the theory of creation just given. The common rung of pseudo-philosophers twists the sense of his teaching and so get carried into apostasy and the teaching of the pre-existence of the world, end quote. Ibn Sina's theory of the form of corporeality, and particularly his reading it back into Aristotle, are the impetus for most post-Avicennan philosophers and theologians' discussions of matter and body, to which I now turn. And this is the final section. Okay, it is almost certainly Ibn Sina's identification of the historical Aristotle with the anti-Aristotelian views of Philoponus, albeit suitably modified, that fueled Ibn Rushd's, the Latin Averroes, animosity towards Ibn Sina in his treatise on the substance of the orbs. The position that Ibn Sina defends in response to, the position that Ibn Rushd defends in response to Ibn Sina is simply that of what is arguably the historical position of Aristotle. Prime matter is essentially potentiality. It's a subject that lacks any actuality and is bereft of any, quote, form in virtue of which it becomes a substance, end quote, like Ibn Sina's form of corporeality. Ibn Rushd complains that Ibn Sina's position leads to numerous absurdities. All of those absurdities follow upon Ibn Rushd's conviction that no substance can have more than one substantial form. For instance, both a substantial form of corporeality and a species form by which it is the specific substance that it is, as Ibn Sina apparently would have it. In short, Ibn Rushd rejects the Avicennan view that a form of corporeality creates a substantial quality that is the potentiality for determinate bodies. Instead, for Ibn Rushd, prime matter as essentially potentiality is a pre-existent given. Thus, Ibn Rushd, even if he's careful not to explicitly say so, bites the proverbial bullet and denies that prime matter as potentiality belongs to the created order. Matter is itself wholly uncreated for Ibn Rushd. Now, in contrast to Ibn Rushd, who returned to Aristotle for his theories of matter and body, post-Avicennan thinkers in the Muslim East seem to have returned to Philoponus, who again attempted to eliminate an underlying potentiality in matter from the analysis of body. Instead, they simply made indeterminate body. Philoponus made indeterminate body, that is, indeterminate three-dimensionality, most basic. Notable instances of this trend in the Islamic East are the Jewish convert to Islam Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi and Sharaf ad-Din al-Masudi, who was following Abu Barakat. Unlike Philoponus, however, who rejected earlier analyses of matter as part of the defense of creation ex nihilo, Abu Barakat's rejection seems motivated on methodological grounds. There simply are no empirical or theoretical reasons for positing some prime matter standing under and metaphysically explaining indeterminate body, or so argues Abu Barakat, and I quote, "We do not sensibly find this thing called prime matter in body, nor does analysis terminate at it, nor does an intellectual proof and a demonstration quia compel us to its doctrine. Thus, the doctrine that you, Ibn Sina, established previously for that already had this answer to it, and you did not establish it going forward in the speculation, end quote. In short, indeterminate body itself for Abu Barakat as well as al-Masudi can perform all the functions that matter is supposed to explain without introducing some further level of metaphysical abstraction. Arguably the most significant and creative innovation concerning body and matter in the post-Avicennan Islamic world is that of Abdul Karim al-Shahristani. Shahristani develops and defends a new form of atomism, ironically drawing significantly on ideas developed in none other than Ibn Sina. Now, as noted, earlier Kalām thinkers maintained that atoms were both physically and conceptually indivisible. Ibn Sina had granted that there may be limits to the physical divisions that body can undergo, even if they are conceptually divisible ad infinitum. For Ibn Sina, these limits of physical division are identified with natural minima. They represent the minimal magnitude required to sustain a particular species form, whether the species form of some mixture, mazaj that is, or that of a given element. Further physical divisions, Ibn Sina argued, result in a mixture's corruption into its elemental parts, or more basic mixtures, or in the case of the elements, into subtler elements, and for instance, extremely heated waters corrupting into air. Such natural minima, when composited, continued Ibn Sina, did not produce a discontinuous aggregate of natural minima, as in atomism, but a continuous whole, which just is the specific kind of body that it is, whether a mixture like blood or an element like water. Shahristani simply helps himself to Ibn Sina's analysis of natural minima, but now extends it to body more generally. Thus, Shahristani maintains that there are minimal spatial units which are atomistic, and so not Aristotelian or Avicennan prime matter. When these spatial minima are brought together, they join to form a continuous body, which one's estimative faculty can conceptually divide infinitely. In other words, whereas Ibn Sina limits natural minima to body qua specific kinds of body, Shahristani maintains that there are spatial minima for body qua generic body. Inasmuch as these minimal spatial units combine to form a continuous body, you probably can't see it on that screen, but I've now superimposed the right triangle, okay? Inasmuch as these minimal spatial units combine to form a continuous body, one can posit or imagine through an act of the estimative faculty lengths of any size so as to accommodate notions like pi and the square root of 2. Thus, Shahristani claims that his new view of atoms can avoid the problems of incommensurability, which underlaid Ibn Sina's mathematically oriented objections to earlier forms of Kalām. Okay, and now this is the very last figure. I'll be very quick. It will be Fakhruddin al-Razi who subtly introduces Shahristani's revised atomism into this discussion surrounding Ibn Sina's account of body. Razi begins by re-envisioning the logical space for a theory of body. Whereas Ibn Sina claimed the body has either 1, A through B, actual parts, whether finite or infinite, or 2, no parts, Razi claims the body has either 1, A through B, actual parts, again, whether finite or infinite, or 2, A through B. So he's expanded our 2 option here. Potential parts, either finite in number, Shahristani's view, or infinite in number, purportedly Ibn Sina's view. Razi accepts Ibn Sina's criticisms of 1A through B and even defends 2B, that is to say Ibn Sina's view, against the earlier criticism of Abu Barakat and al-Masudi. Despite that defense, Razi ultimately rejects Ibn Sina's position. While his criticism of Ibn Sina's view is complex, it essentially is a recasting of the regress argument, now in terms of Ibn Sina's own modal ontology of necessary and possible existence. And Ibn Sina's claim that matter is the bearer, the mahal, of possibility. So, presumably, although Razi is not explicit about this point, no corresponding regress ensues for Shahrastani's minimal spatial units and their composition into determinate three-dimensional bodies. I will not bore you by doing a summary conclusion, but simply hope that you have enjoyed my body tale.